Hi, in this video I'm going to be providing evidence that Atlantis and Athens really did exist during the Ice Age, and that the claim made by the Egyptian priest that said that the story of Atlantis dates back to 9,000 years before the time of Solon, which is 9600 BC, and for us, over 11,600 years ago, has a lot of support behind it. Now, the question of how old Atlantis is actually tied together with how old Athens and Egypt are. Because the Egyptian priests in the story of Atlantis actually claim that not only did this civilization named Atlantis exist as far back as 9600 BC, but that Athens actually existed as a city at that time too, which is something that is completely in contradiction with what mainstream scholars believe. And also at the time that Egypt also existed as a civilization with a written language that was able to preserve the story of these civilizations in the form of writing and to actually pass them down to the age of Solon, which was in around 600 BC. And so the idea is that not only is this civilization named Atlantis dating back to the last ice age, but at the same time, these other civilizations, Egypt and Athens, Greece, are also dating back to this ancient time. And so we have a story of basically three different cultures. It's not just about Atlantis, it's about Atlantis, Athens, and Egypt. This is an interesting observation that I noticed, and it doesn't seem very interesting at first. It just seems like a really unimportant detail that's part of the narrative, but let's look at this more carefully. The Athenians in the time of 9600 BC and earlier were described by the Egyptian priest as having migrated to the northern and the southern side of their, because at the same time, right now we know that Athens is the Acropolis of Athens is actually on top of a large hill, and that's how Athens is. Athens is not built on a flat area; it's built on top of a large hill, and it's that's something that you can see, you can verify by just typing in Athens into Google or searching Wikipedia. You'll see the clear, um, you'll see that the city is built on top of a hill. And so the Egyptian priests claim that just as Athens now is built on top of a hill, Athens then was also on top of a large hill. And then he described the Athenians as having migrated to the north side of the hill during the winter and the southern side during the summer, as you can see here. On the north side, they lived there in the winter, and during the summertime, they lived on the southern side of the hill. Now, the reason for this is very clear. Just as, like, for example, in the northern hemisphere, the sun is always on the southern side. The sun is always facing the south, and the north face of any mountain is always blocked from the sun's direct rays, whereas the south side is always facing the sun's rays. So the north side, just like how on a mountain, for example, you'll see that the north side of a mountain always has more snow on it because it's cooler there and it takes a longer time for the snow to melt. And so that's an interesting observation that we can kind of apply to understand this particular passage. Think of it as kind of like a primitive form of air conditioning and heating. People want to equalize the temperature variations over the course of a season. So in the winter you turn on you turn on the heater, and during the summer you turn on the air conditioning. But at the time, obviously, there was no air conditioning or heating. So people migrated to the northern side of the southern side of a hill in order to reduce those temperature variations over time. And this is a direct this is a map. This is kind of like a diagram showing that concept. In the northern hemisphere, of course, in which Athens is located in the northern hemisphere, the south face of any kind of hill or mountain receives more direct sunlight, whereas the north face receives less direct sunlight because the sun's rays are actually blocked because of this obstruction in the way. So the north face is always cooler, the south face is always warmer. Now, as for Atlantis, now we'll get back to exactly why this is a problem. because this doesn't seem like a problem right now. It just seems like an observation, and doesn't seem like why I'm actually making a video to talk about that something that's so apparently trivial. And as for Atlantis, where was it? Well, we can use the process of elimination in order to find out where it was. We know that it was certainly in the tropical latitudes, that is less than 30 degrees north or south. Because look at the description provided by the Egyptian priest of Atlantis and the particular plants and animals that live there. Whatever fragrant things that are now in the earth, essences which distill from fruits and flower. And if you look at this description, it's like a place that has an enormous amount of vegetation and of plant life. And we really don't see any place here on Earth that is in the temperate latitudes, that is above 30 degrees south or north, that has any kind of vegetation or any kind of plant life that's anywhere remotely similar to this. And so we know that during the Ice Age, which is supposedly when this story dates back to, that the tropical latitudes were even narrower than they are today. That is, it was colder at every single latitude, so 30 degrees north would have been colder than it is now. So to get into the tropical areas, you would have to go farther south. So more likely during the Ice Age, the so-called tropical latitudes would have been maybe around 25 north to 25 south. Really almost entirely very close to the actual Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, a smaller tropical area. So we know that Atlantis is going to be somewhere between maybe around 25 north to 25 south. But at the same time, we know that Atlantis isn't really right on the equator or anywhere near it, because in the equator, you have the same climate year round. You don't have very many, you have the same daylight length, you have the same amount of precipitation over the year. But Atlantis was actually described as having precipitation patterns that varied significantly throughout the seasons. For example, during the winter, there was a lot of rain that fell, but during the summer, there wasn't enough rain, so therefore they had to create an irrigation system, which is described in a lot of detail in the Plato's dialogues, that allows for that rain that fell in the winter to be supplied to the fields in order for a second growing season to actually to be taken advantage of. But tropical rainforests, or anywhere very close to the equator, will not have those variations in precipitation. Therefore, we know that, for example, and this is a diagram showing exactly where those tropical rainforests are. And as you can see, it is concentrated very, very close to the equator. If you even go a tiny bit above the equator, the tropical rainforests just vanish. So it's a very, very narrow strip. So we know that Atlantis could not have been inside this region that I've shaded. But at the same time, that Atlantis needs to be within this kind of 25 to 30 north and south range that I've described. So Atlantis is to be found somewhere here. It's to be found somewhere here. For example, this Indian subcontinent would be a good example of where Atlantis, the latitude range in which Atlantis could be. And also Southeast Asia would be a good example of that latitude range. Not so far away from the equator that there isn't a huge amount of vegetation and a great amount of biological productivity, but at the same time not so close to the equator that there isn't any variation in the climate and the precipitation patterns that characterize that extremely narrow strip of latitudes in which there is that's typically described as a tropical rainforest. And also, we are very, very reasonably sure that Atlantis was in the northern hemisphere as opposed to the southern hemisphere, because right now, 88% of people live in the northern hemisphere. And the distribution of land across the earth only 10,000 years ago was likely very much the same as it is now. And and the southern hemisphere, just as it's a place where a few people live today, that is not really going to change. The earth does not significantly change over a period of 10,000 years, at least the shape of the continents, their relative locations with each other. So even if we knew nothing else about Atlantis, we could have presumed that it has really a 90% chance of being in the northern hemisphere, which really kind of eliminates a huge percentage of the possible places that Atlantis could be. But we know we can be even more certain that Atlantis was in the northern hemisphere because Atlantis was described as being an island that's outside the Pillars of Heracles. And the Pillars of Heracles, as I established in another video, which I'll talk about in future videos, is the Strait of Gibraltar. And if something is an island in front of the Straits of Gibraltar, it's definitely in the northern hemisphere. And so, knowing that range of areas in which Atlantis could be, we have established that Atlantis is in the northern hemisphere. But if you look at the precipitation patterns of latitudes in the northern hemisphere that's outside the immediate equatorial zone, as we have established, but that's kind of not in the temperate zones, we have established that Atlantis is somewhere in between these two red lines that we've drawn, as I've talked about in previous slides. But within these areas, we have a clear precipitation pattern. The latitudes within these latitudes, see this pink dashed line right here? This pink dashed line tells you that it's the month of August, as you can see here, the pink dashed line. In August, you have the most precipitation. And an example of a month in which there is very little precipitation, for example, is the purple and the blue lines. The purple line is pointed to right here, and the blue line is pointed to right here. And the purple and blue lines, as you can see, are January and February. And so within these latitude ranges in which Atlantis is likely almost certain to exist, we have during the winter months a low amount of precipitation, and during the summer months a high amount of precipitation. I've used these 3 months as examples, and it's not necessarily the case that those 3 months should be the general trend for that part of the season which they represent, but it's the case. You have a lot of precipitation during the summer and a very small amount of precipitation during the winter. But what's the problem with that Plato's account? A lot of precipitation in the summer, but here it says that in the winter they had the benefit of the rains in heaven in Plato's dialogue. And in summer they didn't have enough rain, so they had to use the rain that was released from the canals. But as we can see, during the summer, in this example, in this slide, during the summer is when there is a lot of rain. But here, during the summer, there isn't enough rain. And so we have, even though Atlantis should have been in the northern hemisphere, within these latitudes in which a precipitation pattern of lots of rain in the summer and very little during the winter should exist, we have in Plato's dialogue the reverse of that situation. And so a lot of people will just think, oh, well, this is just an error, right? It's easy to just reverse the seasons. That's just a simple mistake. But is it a simple mistake? Because in the previous slide, we showed that the Athenians, they lived on the north side during the winter. But the north side is actually cooler during the winter because the sun's rays are actually blocked from it. So the Athenians, they would have actually moved to a place that's even colder during the winter, and during the summer, the Athenians moved to the south side of the hill. But the south side of the hill is always going to be warmer because it's facing direct sunlight. So during the hot part of the season, the Athenians moved to an even hotter place. And what is that like? That's like somebody choosing to turn on the air conditioner during the winter when it's already really cold, and turning on the heater during the summer when it's already really warm. It's actually amplifying the natural temperature variations. And so anybody who is so stupid as to actually turn on the air conditioning during the winter and turning on the the heater during the summer, they're not going to survive. Like, these people are not. That's just this completely irrational migration pattern that just contradicts everything that we know about human nature, which is to minimize those temperature variations over time. And so the fact that in both the cases of the Athenians migrating, the seasons are reversed, and in the case of the Atlantean precipitation patterns, the seasons are reversed. If only one of those reversions happened, we could really attribute it to an error in the recording of this dialogue. But the fact that both of these seasonal patterns are actually reversed is, in my opinion, evidence that there is a solution to this problem. And that the solution to this problem is that if the story of Plato was half a precession cycle old, the precession cycle is 26,000 years, so half of the precession cycle is 13,000 years old, the seasons really would have been reversed. But if Plato's account was only around 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, that wouldn't have been enough time for the seasons to have reversed themselves. And so the fact that all of these seasons are reversed in Plato's story is proof positive that the story of Plato has to be 13,000 years old or around there. Because otherwise, the seasonal reversion shouldn't have happened. And the reversion of the seasons, if you have a double negative, you have a positive. So the fact that there is a negation or a reversal in the fact that the seasons were reversed in the Plato's dialogues, if it was 13,000 years ago or close to it, then that would have reversed the seasons once again, and that would have taken you back to the correct seasonal patterns. But the ancient Greeks didn't know about precession in the time of Plato, so they couldn't have really added that into the story. Therefore, this seeming error and this seeming mistake in which the Athenians migrated from the southern to the northern side of their hill, and the fact that the weather patterns and the precipitation patterns of Atlantis were described as reversed, has a solution if the story of Atlantis was around 13,000 plus or minus a few years. And we know that Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before the time of Plato. We know that Athens was said to have been destroyed 9,000 years before the time of Plato. And so they must have existed for a few thousand years beforehand. So that puts the time of these civilizations all the way to around 12 to 13,000 years before the time of Solon, which would be around 15,000 years ago before the present day. And I believe that this seemingly contradictory reversion of the seasons and the seasonal migrations of the Athenians is the best evidence that we have to establish that the story of Atlantis really does date back to the Ice Age, and that the 9,000 years ago claim for the destruction of these civilizations, therefore, has support.